to the Gwinnett County Public Library's Community Conversations, The History of Juneteenth. Our partner for this series is the Gwinnett Remembrance Coalition. I am Ron Goche, Youth Services and Community Partnerships Manager for Gwinnett County Public Library. Tonight's moderator is Dr. Paul Grant. He is an associate professor of political science in the School of Liberal Arts at Georgia Gwinnett College. He teaches American government, state and local government, and Georgia politics courses. His published and presented research topics include race, ethnicity, and politics, legislative studies, and state government and politics. Dr. Grant studied the social, political, and economic climate of South Africa 10 years after the end of apartheid on a Fulbright Hays Fellowship. He is a member of the GGC Sustainability Committee and co-founder of the GGC Community Microforum. Welcome, Dr. Paul Grant.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much. And it's great to see everyone here this evening. I want to thank our panelists for participating. And let me see. Ron, would you like to go ahead and share some of the activities on Juneteenth in the county, or would you like me to go?
Sure, I can start with that.
Okay, please go ahead.
I always said I could not be a good librarian if I don't recommend some good library titles correlating to this subject. So I'll share with you some of the activities that we actually have occurring at the Gwinnett County Public Libraries. So one of these is Voicing Black Liberation, Wednesday, that's tomorrow, at the Mountain Park Library, and that's from 5 to 6 p.m. So if you can attend, please do so and let the community know. Another we have, which is today, this happened. I want to share with you those that have already passed because you'll be aware of what we've been offering. A Juneteenth Lunch and Learn earlier today at our beautiful Peachtree Corners branch. Saturday, June the 10th, at the Lilburn branch, we had another celebration at the beautifully new built Lilburn branch. Also on Sunday, June the 11th, we had the famous percussionist and storyteller, Jerry G. Wright, and he presented at our Snellville branch. And I think you all are aware, I'll make you aware that we're working closely to opening a brand new Snellville branch that will be forthcoming. On Friday, June the 16th, we have a special presentation at the Decula branch. Come celebrate Juneteenth with the family. Okay. Then at the Five Forks branch on Saturday, we will have another celebration of African-American history with a family-friendly craft and snack. And then on Sunday at the Duluth branch, we have an awesome celebration of African-American culture. And now let me recommend a few really good books that I think are appropriate considering the subject. So I don't think I need to introduce this extraordinary writer, Annette Gordon Reed, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner and an author. She got the Pulitzer Prize for a book called The Hemmings of Monticello, the story of Thomas Jefferson's liaison with Sally Hemings and her children. And she also wrote the brilliant book on Juneteenth. Every book that I present to you, it's available at your library. So you just need a library card. And speaking of Sally Hemings and the liaison, here's some other books about that experience. Master of the Mountain, Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves, an amazing blockbuster of a book that describes in detail all of the slaves that Thomas Jefferson owned, how he ran his plantations, and so on and so forth. One of the popular books at one time was Sally Hemings by Barbara Chase Ribard. That was a novel, a fictionalized version of Thomas Jefferson's liaison with Sally Hemings. And then Thomas Jefferson, the Sally Hemings sex scandal. Also, while thinking about that, that brings us to history. William Wells Brown was the first African-American author to pen a novel. And the title of that novel was Clotel, or the President's Daughter. So the first novel written by an African-American in this country was Clotel, about, again, Thomas Jefferson's liaison. Now, this is fiction, a fictionalized account of Thomas Jefferson's liaison with Sally Hemings and their children. Really an incredible novel. Okay. We also have The Great Juneteenth by Ralph Ellison. Now, Ralph Ellison wrote this book Unfortunately, he did not live long enough to see its publication. It was published just a few years ago. A massive manuscript, really in depth. So we highly recommend this. Also, we've got the great Zora Neale Hurston wrote a book called Barracoons, a survivor of the slave ships, part of the Middle Passage. So we know that she was not only a writer, but she was considered the first African-American female filmmaker for doing a documentary. So keep your eyes open for this one. And we know she's the author of the classic, Their Eyes Were Watching God and Ask My Mule. Then we have the sweeping novel, Jubilee. This novel is now probably over 50 years old. It was written by Margaret Walker, probably one of the most in-depth, descriptive, horrifying novels about the slave era in Georgia I have ever read. The pictures you see are, first of all, Margaret Walker to the right, and that's her great-great-grandmother, Viri, the slave child of her master and one of the slave mistresses. Powerful novel. It's a must-read. Also, we have The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. We talk a lot about the wealth that slavery created for the country. Here's a book that really details that experience. And you can get in dollar and cents, you can get in actual factual documents exactly how much money was made off of slave labor. Then there was Ebony and Ivy. So our Ivy League institutions were certainly involved in the proliferation of slavery and total support of it. Great book to read. Then we have The Internal Enemy, which was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. So I always search for those first. Then it was Freedom's Dominion. Now, this is amazing, a saga of white resistance to federal power. Here's a book where the author researched different areas in Alabama to determine what was the resistance against any federal intervention to help former slaves, Native Americans, and so on and so forth. So it begins in the early 1800s all the way up to Wallace's tough stance in Alabama. And here are three of those that I just love. Frederick Douglass, we've read his autobiographies, which are great, and I see they're must reading, but also the author of David W. Blight, a very eminent historian. He wrote a brilliant biography of Frederick Douglass that won the Pulitzer Prize. Then here's a fiction account, The Underground Railroad, which was amazing, by Colson Whitehead. And then Until Justice Be Done, another finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Then we have two brilliant novels, Cane River and Red River, by Lolita Tatamy. She writes about her ancestors, so she does a lot of genealogy, and then she works that into this very descriptive, powerful way into fiction. Cane River and then Red River. Red River actually is based on a true event that happened in Louisiana. In 1873 massacre of some African-American men who were working for the state as militiamen, and as they tried to protect the courthouse, unfortunately, all of them were massacred, and that became a landmark case. And while thinking about that case, here's a nonfiction version that goes into detail. Unpunished Murder, Massacre at Colfax and the Quest for Justice, a must read. This is a story of these men who tried to defend their constitutional right to hold office. They were massacred, and this led to a Supreme Court case in 1876 that essentially weakened the 14th Amendment. This is a must read. The 14th Amendment was scrutinized by the Supreme Court, and it was decided that these men were not murdered by the state of Louisiana. They were slaughtered by a private army of citizens, so it should have, instead of federal jurisdiction, state jurisdiction. And as we know what would happen after that, we see mob violence occur throughout the country for years. So a definite must read in a very classic case. Then we have Envision and Emancipation. Some very good primary documents are available here. Letters, diary entries, and lots of photographs of African Americans during the end of slavery. And then here are three of my favorite. These are some books about African Americans who served during the Civil War. Thunder at the Gates, Reminiscences of My Life in the Camp by Susan King Taylor. Susan King Taylor was the first African American nurse. She was a teacher. There's actually a play about Susan King Taylor that's out in, I think it was Savannah last year. Fascinating story, this autobiography of her life. And there it is. So that play was back in, I think it was last year, in fact, May 28th. Then, of course, we have Alex Haley, Roots. We know that sensational blockbuster novel that became a television series that literally mesmerized the world. And then he was the author of the autobiography of Malcolm X. And then my face is black. It's true. When we think about the reparations movement, here's a woman at the turn of the century who led that fight to fight for pensions and pay for ex-slaves. They were agent slaves at the time. A must read, a pickup that you can't put down. Sweet Taste of Liberty, a true story of slavery and restitution in America. Another Pulitzer Prize winner in 2020. This is a story of an ex-slave who actually sued the people who kidnapped her, and she would actually win her case against them. It's a long story to get there. So that's where we'll stop. And I hope that you will use your library card, check out these items, and keep something in mind. This is just a few of what we have. We have just an extraordinarily wide variety of books on this subject that's available in fiction and nonfiction. If you need any assistance selecting titles, visit any of our libraries at any time, and we can help you find something. Okay.
That was great, Ron. Thank you so much for sharing that bibliography. And I'm gonna, later on, I'll ask Professor Brown if there's anything else he might recommend that people take a look at. But it's so important to be informed by this. Let's talk about our topic today. Juneteenth commemorates the date, June 19th, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger led troops into Galveston to ensure that the Emancipation Proclamation was enforced, effectively freeing the last Confederate community of enslaved African Americans in Texas. Let me add a little historical context just to understand why this is noteworthy. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was published January 1st, 1863. It declared slaves free in states at war against the United States. Now, of course, this required Union troops to be present to enforce the proclamation, and this did not occur in Texas until June of 1865. This was more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. The 13th Amendment, which actually abolished slavery, was ratified December 6, 1865. Now, since June 19th, 1865, Black Texans have continued to celebrate the day throughout Texas, and celebrations have spread throughout the United States. After efforts of the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation, numerous activists, including one senior citizen activist, Opal Lee, Congress passed legislation making Juneteenth a national holiday. On June 17th, 2021, President Biden signed the bill establishing the Juneteenth National Independence Day. All 50 states either commemorate or observe Juneteenth, but only 18 observe it as a permanent paid state holiday. Georgia is included. Last year, many Americans were surprised to learn that Juneteenth had become a national holiday. Perhaps the legislative process that brought about the holiday was not noticed by many because the nation was in the throes of the COVID pandemic. Also, we as a nation were experiencing a racial awakening after the murder of George Floyd and other victims of police brutality. So today, Americans have two independent days celebrating freedom. One celebrating freedom from an oppressive British monarch, King George III, and the second celebrating freedom from oppressive, enslaving Southern state governments. Now, in one way, Americans can view the first American Independence Day as hypocritical because it not only included slavery, but early American federal and state governments excluded the rights of other people of color, women, and in many cases, even white males who did not own property. None of these types of individuals were included in the concept of we the people. However, in a second way, Juneteenth speaks to the American propensity to eventually self-correct. The Juneteenth holiday is evidence we are able to look at ourselves as a nation and our history critically. Juneteenth may be symbolic of the possibility we can recognize mistakes and take corrective action. My grandmother, who I used to call Nana, used to tell me, when you know better, you do better. Even in the midst of efforts to limit education about our nation's troubled racial past and present, Juneteenth, the Juneteenth holiday, provides hope that we are continuing to strive toward that more perfect union. This evening, we have three panelists: a scholar who will discuss the history of June 19th as it has been experienced in Texas, a local activist who's been engaged in efforts to celebrate Juneteenth right here in Gwinnett County, and hopefully we'll be joined by a leader of the Gwinnett Remembrance Coalition who will share some of the coalition's accomplishments around making people aware of the racial past of Gwinnett County and racial justice issues. And with that, let me go ahead and again welcome our wonderful panelists who are joining us this evening, and also tell you a little bit about them. Let me start with Professor Brown. Professor Anthony Brown is Professor of Curriculum and Instruction in Social Studies Education at the University of Texas at Austin. He is also an affiliated faculty in the areas of Cultural Studies and Education, the John Warfield Center of African American and African Studies, and the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies. He received his BA and MA in Political Science, which I was not aware of, from California State, Long Beach, and received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Brown is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Texas Region Outstanding Teaching Award and the AERA Division B 2016 Outstanding Book Award. I want to welcome Professor Anthony Brown. Also joining us is Mr. Innocent Wamley. Innocent Wamley is a serial entrepreneur, engineer, innovator, and branding expert. He is Vice President of the United Ebony Society. Mr. Wamley is founder of VIP Socio, a global tech platform that provides ticketing and e-commerce marketplace solutions focused on Afro-Black culture. He has worked in the technology industry, building systems and products for multinational corporations. He has held key engineering and leadership positions at several major technology firms. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from Virginia Tech and an MBA from Georgia State University. He is extremely passionate about Afro-Black culture and history. And we welcome you this evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
Okay. Well, Dr. Brown, you are kind of at the center of everything in Texas, where everything started.
Yes.
Please tell us a little bit about your perspective from what you have seen there in Texas as it relates to the African-American community's experience, any history. Please go ahead and share.
So as you stated, Dr. Grant, Juneteenth comes out of the kind of racial politics of the Civil War, starting with the signing of the General Order Number 3 on June 19th, 1865, announcing that all enslaved Africans were free. It stands as one of the more important historical documents in Texas history, and as African American history as a whole. But it took about, a lot of people ask the question, like, why did it take so long for the information to get to Texas? And one of the things that I think most people don't understand, Texas seems to be left out of the history of enslavement and the history of the Confederacy. Like, even some people will even ask, I remember years ago when I first moved here and I asked a question to a friend of mine who grew up in Austin, and I laughed. I said, is Texas or is Austin really the South? And he laughed and he says, I know some people see it as the Southwest, but he goes, I'm going to ask you two questions. He says, were there enslaved Africans in this region of the country, in Austin, in Central Texas? And the answer, of course, I said, yes. He says, were there Jim Crow policies that kept African Americans from being able to exercise their civil rights that went all the way to the 1960s and beyond? And I answered yes to that. He says, well, then it is in fact 100% that Texas is a Southern state. But one of the things that is not understood is that the reason why the information did not get to Texas is because it is its location. So there was the first writing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and then there was the enforcement. And enforcement usually came by way of Union troops. It usually said it could have little impact if it didn't have the support of Union troops. So about 2.5 years later, in June 1865, more than 2,000 federal soldiers of the 13th Army Corps arrived in Galveston, and it was Major General Gordon Granger, who was the commanding officer of District of Texas. He delivered to Galveston General Orders Number 3. The order informed all Texans, in accordance with the proclamation, that from the executive order of the United States, all enslaved Africans were free. If you read the actual document, it would state in the following words, that on the first day of January AD 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforth forever free. And there's even a part that begins to talk about the changing relationship between those that provide jobs and work. So the division of labor changes now, where compensation becomes a means of defining the relationship for those that work on farms during that time. As you can imagine, the people of Galveston receiving this information, crying, weeping, laughing, joyous kind of disbelief. And immediately, historians have recorded celebration in different forms. Some forms of celebration were more somber, by way of memorializing the experience, prayer, church services, singing. Some were more jovial, marches and celebration. But that became a tradition. So when you think about Juneteenth in the context of Texas, you also have to understand it in the context of liberation celebrations that were happening during that time around Southern states in general. By about the 1920s or 30s, these kinds of freedom celebrations waned for different reasons: changing demographics, aggressiveness towards African Americans being able to express themselves in public spaces. There's a great book, and I could reference it at some point. The book is actually called Southern Past by James Fitzhugh. And he talks about the kind of history of celebrations in one of the chapters of the book. So we have to think about Juneteenth as fitting the context of these kinds of freedom celebrations. However, what was interesting is that Texans continued the tradition of celebrating and creating a very unique experience reflective of the history of Texas, using this also over periods of time as a political platform for African Americans to not only celebrate the actual day, to commemorate the day, to speak of the day, to do simulations of the day and read poetry to reflect the day, singing of the day. It also served as a place for African Americans to express the current conditions related to Jim Crow politics of its time, the racial politics of Texas. And even to this day, you would see celebrations that are not just coming to remember the actual date of 1865 in Galveston, Texas. It's often used as a platform for African Americans. So what's interesting is that, like I said, while by the early 1900s, freedom celebrations began to wane, Juneteenth celebration continued. But by 1980, 79, it was proposed, by 1980, Juneteenth became a state holiday in the state of Texas, often filled with food, celebration, memorials, marches, barbecues, music. It became without a doubt the quintessential Black history holiday in Texas, even to this day. I even recall my wife asking the question, why is Wisconsin having a Juneteenth celebration? And even expressing some sort of possessiveness with the passing of the Juneteenth national holidays. In her words, Juneteenth belongs to Texas. And even there has been some question of Juneteenth being kind of a catch-all for all and anything related to African-American freedom without it being specific to this particular historical moment. I even recall my children are part of an organization called Jack and Jill, which I know they're very familiar with in Georgia. The wife was talking about scheduling her wedding date on June 19th and how the family were up in arms because she was from Detroit and had no understanding of why it was important for her not to celebrate their wedding, or to have their wedding celebration on June 19th. So to understand, it's a very much a cultural phenomena, sometimes attached to its history. In many cases, if you were to ask young people this history, they're not going to wax poetic understanding it. They just understand it as an important moment where African Americans come together and celebrate in different means. So come June 19th, you'll see some aspects of it reflected in the kind of popular imagination here in Austin. But in many cases, you're going to have those tried and true traditions that the state has always had in places like Beaumont, Texas, Galveston, Texas, Lubbock, Texas, and very much the same kinds of traditions that we see related to like a king holiday are reflected on June 19th.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. I have a couple of follow-up questions based on what you said. So it sounds like, if I understand correctly, that around the early 1900s, maybe around the time of Black Summer, where you start to see a lot of violence against African Americans starting to assert themselves a couple of generations after slavery, that there were efforts to, I guess, perhaps reduce the opportunities for African American communities to celebrate this holiday. Is that
Yes,
the way of
yes, Fitzhugh makes that clear that there are more strident policies placed on African Americans congregating in public spaces. The resources that were made available to have celebrations of this kind, being able to like block off blocks, the kinds of things that you would need to have a major celebration became more difficult and challenging. Some even argue that the changing demographics of the South also impacted. So you have, in some cases, early 1900s, as many as 1 million migrating to out of places that would celebrate. In Texas in particular, the migration goes west more so than north. So places like Oakland and Los Angeles are kind of made like in the same sense that Arkansas is to Chicago, might have had some impact on these kinds of celebrations throughout the South.
And you were saying that some native Texans, African Americans, are not as, in some cases, not as thrilled about folks around the country taking the Texas holiday. Speak a little more on that.
From the context of listening to people in the community, there of course is when it became a national holiday, I think people are surprised. It's one of those things. I'll give you a quick example here at my university. When at University of Virginia, when that man drove through the community when they were fighting over the monuments,
Sure.
It created a kind of discussion around the kinds of monuments University of Texas had. And the current president at Emory who was the president at UT, was able to convene a committee, and overnight the monuments were gone. And I remember my colleagues and I, we were both surprised by how could something that has such a, strong tradition, a strong resistance to its not being present in a kind of Confederate imagination in the South immediately be removed from a major institution like UT. I think the same thing was felt about Juneteenth, that concessions certainly were made, and there's an interesting history behind the politics around how African Americans were able to kind of galvanize and come together and push for it being a holiday. I think some have argued that one of the interesting concessions is that legislators will give us representation, but they won't give us restitution in some cases. So they'll give us a holiday, they will give us something symbolic, but nothing structural or concrete will rarely be given. They'll be rigid. Although here in the state of Texas and all around, and many librarians are feeling this, the issue of representation is on attack in dramatic ways. So in some sense, I think there is going to be a greater significance of holidays of this kind. 1915, Carter G. Woodson kind of instituted the space to teach history and saw that as kind of the Magna Carta of his program, of his work around addressing or redressing the miseducation, was to have community spaces. Negro History Week would go from small towns, and it would do the kind of work that schools were not doing. So in many respects, I think this is a wonderful opportunity for communities such as libraries and community centers to really take a very front and center redressing of what is being removed from our schools. So when you think about all the books that were put on the screen and the topics that are addressed in those screens, those are being brought to question. And so there's a very interesting racial politics in the state of Texas where race becomes, two things happen that are contradictory to what's happening around race and knowledge in the state of Texas. State of Texas becomes one of the first states to institute African American studies, while at the same time, the lieutenant governor puts in place anti-CRT policies, right? Texas also becoming one, if you look on a map where there are bans around topics around, Texas is one of those states that has a lot of county bans around books that are being, in circulation in schools and in libraries. But at the same time, it was one of the first to have a Juneteenth celebration. So Texas is a unique kind of space where there's these open possibilities, like we're scratching our head in the middle of a racial reckoning, in the middle of a very contentious racial politics around the presidency. We have these moments where things change. So I hope that gets at some of your questions.
It absolutely does, and it speaks to something else I briefly want to ask you about, because I was joking earlier. I didn't realize that you were also a political scientist. I thought you were purely education. So, and we have not talked about this, but and you alluded to the fact that a lot of people were surprised that we ended up with a Juneteenth holiday. And I looked at the roll call votes in the House, and of course the votes in the Senate. This was one area where you pretty much had consensus.
Yes.
And it's so surprising based on, of course, what you just mentioned, the fact that, a number of these states, especially a number of the red states, are just so against anything about, teaching racial history about the past, those parts that, of course, are not, very positive. But yet there was little opposition to this. So it does kind of speak to kind of an interesting place we're in. And like I said, I don't know if it had to do with COVID. I don't know if it had to do kind of post George Floyd, where people were thinking, we need to look at these things more critically and make some changes. But do you have any thoughts about that, Professor Brown?
I'm trying to wrap my head around these kinds of contradictions. And it may be just the kind of the way politics is kind of engaged at the state legislature as these brokered deals, things that I think where concessions are made for things that seem to have no impact in some cases. I think knowledge has a lot of currency now. It provides a political platform for people to use. So when CRT became the boogeyman of ideas, I think it became the perfect storm for political ideologues that were concerned with advancing their own interests in the state of Texas to use that. So it's a kind of but at the same time, state of Texas passed one of the most progressive crown policies around which there are only few states that have crown. These kind of protect African-American women and others that have more ethnic hair or wear kind of hijab or other forms. I don't have the kind of specifics of the policy, but I know many were surprised in the same legislative session, right? So the same legislative session, you have attacks on tenure, attacks on academic freedom, attacks on DEI, and then the passing of crown policy. I think it's just a matter of the selection of certain ideas become mobilized in the public in effective ways to kind of incite support for certain interests. But there's also the kind of backdoor deals that I think certain state legislators on the right and left are willing to sign off on that seem harmless at the time. I think this was one of those moments. I think this happens after the anti-CRT. So a CRT becomes an effective means to kind of advance a particular kind of politics. I think that's, I don't know if Juneteenth passed in the midst of Juneteenth, but perhaps it did in the same sense that the crown policy was able to. So I don't have a direct response. It might also just be the up and down contradictory nature of racial politics or public policy in the state of Texas, just like the weather and everything else.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, all right. Well, thank you. Now let's hear a little bit about Juneteenth in Gwinnett County and some of the things that have been happening recently in recent years, but also what's planned for this year. And let's turn it over to Mr. Whammy, Innocent. Tell us a little bit about the Ebony Society and some of the work that they've been doing in the community, specifically around Juneteenth, and what we can look forward to this year.
Well, thank you, Dr. Grant. First, thank you guys for actually having me on this panel, very esteemed panel. So I'm part of United Ebony Society. I actually stumbled on the organization in 2020. I ran into Miss Opal Lee in Fort Worth. And I, being a naturalized citizen, was asking the same questions that a lot of people ask about Juneteenth. And I was not clear why the celebration was so important, but he actually explained how it affected her family, what it meant to her growing up in Texas, like Dr. Brown was saying. And she went further to kind of talk in broad terms about the significance of actually celebrating Juneteenth, right? What I got out of that was her focus was freedom, right? This country, the whole tenet of this country is based on freedom. You can't have that or a perfect union without everybody really being free, right? So as much as it's a Texas holiday, in her mind, it needs to be celebrated by everybody, because in her own words, if one person is free, everybody else is free. And when I met her, I was surprised because at 89 years old, decided to take on this course to get Juneteenth declared as a holiday. Started walking 2.5 miles every year to symbolize the 2.5 years it took for the Emancipation Proclamation to actually get enforced when the Union Army got to Galveston. And then she went on to do her walk to Washington, D.C., basically getting invited to multiple cities it all culminated in the petition that they ran that ended up having 1.6 million people sign that. My organization, VIP Social, actually accompanied her to DC to deliver that petition. It was more so symbolic, right? So in a way, it brought a lot of visibility to it. And when Biden came into power, he went ahead and signed it. Personally, for me, I look at Juneteenth, having kids that are American born right now, I look at Juneteenth as really a segment for us to take time and educate people that do not understand our struggle, educate our kids on actually the significance of that freedom to us, because they get taught the Constitution, the laws that we have right now, and it's really difficult to have perspective on, let's say, an understanding of, let's say, redlining laws, an understanding of, let's say, the 14th Amendment, where citizenship actually got defined, right? The 15th Amendment, right? The right to vote. If you do not really go back and look at what happened after 1865, the way the states reacted to Black people, to former slaves being free, right? They reacted with a bunch of laws to try to restrict their freedom, right? Which led to it being ratified in the 13th Amendment, the slavery being ratified, so it could not be changed by another president or anybody else that came into power, right? After that happened, we got into Reconstruction. So our kids really need to understand, and the general public has to really understand why some of these things happened, why the Voting Rights Act was critical, right? Why they had to, the 14th Amendment had to define citizenship and actually protect the rights of people under law. These all stem from the freedom that the enslaved people had. So today's world and the world in which I operate my business is, we do not rely on media. We do not rely on, let me say, public media. We as a people, in celebrating this, have a voice to actually tell the story, even if it's not being told in schools right now, right? With the social media, with the way the world is connected now, we actually have an opportunity to sidestep them maybe not teaching in the school, or put pressure by actually celebrating this holiday and explaining to our kids, explaining to people the meaning of freedom, not just to Black people, but to every other community, what it means to them. Because after the slaves got free, you had that 14th Amendment, right? That 14th Amendment is the basis for Roe v. Wade. It's the basis for gender equality, right? And a bunch of other amendments to the Constitution, the 1920 amendments to the Constitution, that are born out of these amendments that were really meant to protect the formerly enslaved, right? And really, most important for me, from my own perspective, it actually explains a lot of what happens today. It actually explains the mindset of people in Congress, right? It explains a lot of the fear mongering, right? Because if you really look at it historically, they got free, we got freed. The next thing, the freedoms are getting restricted. Then you get the citizenship clearly defined, which as an immigrant, somebody that immigrated into this country, really for me explains the reaction people have to somebody that comes from somewhere, because it explains that zero-sum mentality where it always feels like if one community gets something, the other community feels like they're taking away something from them, which is really not the truth, all right? So for me, us educating people about Juneteenth puts perspective, right? Makes all of us actually look back, because the only way to right wrongs is to actually go back and look at them and see what happened. So for me, Juneteenth, highlighting it one, highlights the problems that we've overcome. Two, brings to the forefront our heroes. I mean, this is a country where we love heroes, right? We love to watch movies. We love to watch. There's so many heroes, including Miss Opal. There's so many heroes that have that had so much courage, that have persevered so much in this country, right? And that have overcome so much in this country. So in teaching this, and that's really what United Ebony Society is about, right? It's bringing awareness to what's happening around us, right? So our involvement in Juneteenth is really in that teaching mode, right? Same thing, the organization, we're the first ones in Gwinnett to actually have an MLK parade back in 1999. One of the founders of United Ebony Society, Robbie Susan Moore, she was the one that actually got a lot of the cities in Atlanta to recognize MLK and to celebrate MLK Day in Gwinnett County, right? And a lot of the activities that United Ebony Society participates in are really focused around that education, building a stronger community, and communicating with church leaders, education leaders, community activists, and business owners, basically bringing people together to raise awareness. So our participation in Juneteenth is really focused around that, right? That education piece is vitally important.
So what will the Juneteenth celebration look like this year? What are some of the activities that are planned by the society?
So it's always a festival, right?
Mhm.
I'm guessing it's emulating Dr. Brown, emulating what used to happen. So it's food, it's kids having fun. It's a little bit of a history lesson or a few people talking about Juneteenth. It's a mini concert. So it's really a celebration of freedom. This year is going to happen on the 17th at Rose Jordan Park. After COVID, we did the first one in 2021. That really had about 1,000 people. Last year, about 1,500 people. We're expecting a lot more people to come out this year. So it's really a celebration. It's an education. It's just letting people enjoy the aspect of freedom of Juneteenth.
That sounds great. Now, I want to kind of speak to both of you about this. And I know, Dr. Brown, you're there in Texas. And of course, we'll be celebrating here in Gwinnett County. But Mr. Whammy, you mentioned food. I understand that there's a tradition around food and the color of food. Either one of you want to speak to that? And if you all don't know, you probably are aware of it subconsciously. So apparently red colored foods are very big for the Juneteenth celebration. And let me see if I have a list of any of them. Again, this was part of my, so red velvet cake, for example, and that red kind of symbolizing, I guess, symbolizing the blood of ancestors, the tragedy suffered by enslaved people. There's even a flag, which, again, I wasn't extremely familiar with. I had seen it, but a flag that celebrates Juneteenth that includes, the colors of red, white, and blue, but a star in the center, which I guess symbolizes, but also kind of a Noah represents new beginning for Black folks. And so there's a whole lot out there, which we're a lot of it new. We're just getting familiar with, but it does speak to what's becoming an incredible tradition in the country. Any thoughts about the fact that we have 2 independent days now that are roughly about 2 weeks apart?
Then you got some of these other significant cultural experiences in music. There's the Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is still considered the Black national anthem. And then there's the flag, the Freedom Liberation flag, red, green, and black. I think black represents the people, green, the land, and red, the blood. So lots of symbols out there. that chronicle the rise of African Americans from slavery up until now.
Mhm. Okay. And there has been some discussion where some have raised concerns about celebrating Juneteenth because they've said that it focuses too much on Black people being saved as opposed to what Black people did to liberate themselves during slavery, efforts that people have taken. Do you all have any thoughts about that, or have you seen any of those articles or heard from people speaking about that?
I actually have. I mean, it seems to be more of an intellectual discussion. It, it's interesting. Texas, the point that was made earlier is that these spaces are becoming more kind of counter educational spaces where people are going to learn in ways and engage in questions around freedom and the experiences of African American past, present, and future. I think that's what we're going to expect to probably see more of. And one of the reasons, one of the positive aspects of it that usually trumps, like, it's more of, again, an intellectual debate about how should we commemorate our agency as a people. The one argument that I actually find compelling is that there are now resources available for counties and districts on a federal level. So Texas, you had funding to run a program at a library, but I think you're even going to have a kind of a national funding that is available, particularly if you're able to make your work a little more specific, little more directly related to community efforts around education and literacy. Right now, I know there's going to be a major celebration. My children, or well, my son, he's a volunteer at a freedom school here in Austin. And I know that some of the work around Juneteenth and it's a literacy program primarily to address something called summer lag, but it's also a space where they engage the question of freedom the entire 6 weeks that students are there. And I think in some cases, part of the funding source for the freedom schools comes from these kind of federal resources that are made available. I think there is going to be more opportunities for community centers and libraries to engage more federal grants related to Juneteenth than we've ever seen in previous periods. We definitely have the negative, which would be, Juneteenth ice cream and Juneteenth hats and the kind of commercialization of Juneteenth as a negative. But I think as long as communities engage it with a sense of agency and purpose, the same way Gwinnett County libraries are doing, it challenges the over commercialization of Juneteenth, where it just becomes a day where people just eat and drink and laugh all day, which in of itself, I think, is agency. If people get a day off from work and to be able to just eat and laugh and take a nap, that's a form of agency that's tied to the division of labor, where African Americans are often required to work longer hours, get paid less. So when we think about ways to commemorate, rest is often taken for granted. It does not have to be an intellectual exercise.
Right.
We're talking about, things that your uncle and I like to talk about.
Right.
Which I'm going to, on record, and people don't know this, is that Dr. Grant's uncle was my professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I see him almost like a father to me. And I wouldn't be in here if it wasn't for his uncle. But that's just a side thing. That's the kind of things that your uncle and I will talk about when I go to Madison in a couple of weeks. But I do think we need to think about the idea of being free, to be able to congregate in a public space without agitation, without there being aggression, and really not taking that kind of engagement for granted.
I agree. And I'm sure you appreciate those comments too.
Hey, Doctor. I've also noticed some reluctance, particularly among the younger people, with a reluctance to celebrate Juneteenth because it is being, they're looking at the current situation that, the current race situation in the country, and it feels like celebrating something that we have not achieved, but it's really them wanting to take, let's say, the voting rights or the Black Lives Movement, and saying, well, why are we celebrating when we haven't gotten there? So I think it falls back on all of these organizations, like what we're doing right now, organizations like United Ebony Society, to actually explain to some of the younger people that these things, progress is a very slow, and tedious process, right? Educating people on what happened in 1865 really would show some people how far we have come, show the perseverance of our fathers or grandfathers or forefathers that went through this, and actually give them perspective, and so they're not giving up on celebrating what we have gained and continuing the struggle, because it is really a slow, tedious process. So some people feel like, well, why are we celebrating right now when it feels like nothing has changed, right? However, much has changed, right? A whole lot has changed. And we need to continue with that struggle, with the understanding that we learned from each of the steps that happened, or which of the historical events that happened before us, to actually enforce that in us. Look at the heroes, and I keep going back to that, highlight the people that had the courage, the strength, the perseverance to get us to where we are. It will fuel this younger generation. So I think the onus is really on us to never stop what we're doing right now, to not hand it over to anybody that does not understand this struggle, to continue to own it and continue to push for it. Otherwise, the younger people might make light of this or disregard it because they feel like the current situation might not be better, even though it's incorrect. But from their point of view, it feels like that.
And I think that's probably an excellent place to end. Thank you, Mr. Whammy, Innocent. I appreciate those comments. And of course, Dr. Brown, I appreciate you as well. And we're right at hours. Is that correct, Ron?
Yes, that's correct. And we do have one question.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay. This is from Tracy J. Was it said that Georgia does not recognize Juneteenth as a paid state holiday? Summer school and other local government offices are closed that day as a recognition.
No, Georgia is on the good list. Georgia does recognize the holiday. It is one of the 18 states.
Okay, awesome. Okay, and that's the only question we have, and we're right at time. So this is perfect.
Okay.
An invigorating discussion. I've learned quite a bit too, quite a bit. So thanks to everyone for joining us and making this panel just so successful in getting the information out to the community.
Right. Well, I'm sorry that Kevin Collins from the Gwinnett Remembrance Coalition was not able to join us. I think possibly due to technical or logistical problems. But I am thankful for those of you who were able to join this evening. Of course, Professor Brown, University of Texas at Austin, and Mr. Innocent Whammy from the United Ebony Society. Your contributions are greatly appreciated, your time and your contributions. And of course, as always, Ron Gauthier with the wonderful bibliography to keep us busy all summer with important and informative summer reading. And of course, Miriam Mayer, who is not visible, but plays a major role in putting these programs together, and they could not be done without her assistance, as well as the wonderful staff at Gwinnett County Public Library. So we're thankful to everyone who helped in the production of a community conversations programs over the past 2 years. Ron?
Okay, well, thanks everybody once again, and we look forward to doing more exciting programs.
Thank you. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.
Happy Juneteenth.
Be
Happy
Juneteenth.
Juneteenth.